Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second IATA Cargo COVID-19 webinar. This time actually based on a lot of your feedback in the first webinar, we're going to focus on special cargo and the impact that this has had throughout the crisis. I am joined today by three speakers to provide the current outlook, and then the impact of this crisis on special cargo, such as live animals, perishables, pharmaceuticals, and dangerous goods. So we'll go through each of these speakers one at a time, and thereafter we're going to enter an interactive session of questions and answers. Before I begin, I just want to mention very briefly that we're still under competition law compliance, and so when you ask your questions, if there are some which we're not in a position to answer because of that, we simply won't answer them. So it's not that we haven't read them or seen them, it's just that we may not be in a position to answer every single question because of that. So here's the agenda for today. I do want to welcome you all and thank you actually for attending, taking the time out of your schedules, and allowing us to look into this very important area. This remains an extremely challenging time for the industry, in particular, although not limited to the impact on special cargo and the operations thereof. Now, we want to hear from our experts, but we also want to hear from you. So we have allocated lots of time for questions and answers. The first speaker of today is Mr. Glyn Hughes. That's IATA's Global Head of Cargo. Glyn will give us some insight on the industry today. So handing over to you, Glyn.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And allow me to please pass on my same welcome to all of our viewers, whether or not it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and I hope you're all staying safe during these very difficult times. Next slide, please, Brendan. Thank you. It's now been 3 months since the first impact on aviation arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. And during that 3-month period, we've seen progressively more and more countries add to travel restrictions that already were in place, and slowly aviation had a significant downturn. As you can see from this picture, this was taken just at the end of 2019, and it really illustrates that aviation is a global connector. And when you consider, next slide please, the situation that we actually have today. Next slide, Brendan. Thank you. Well, we've got back one. We're having a little slow in the technology here. Thank you. Well, we have 2/3 of commercial aircraft are actually grounded. Now that actually has resulted in 4.5 million. In fact, it's a greater number than this now. Just up until the 30th of June, 4.5 million flights have been cancelled. And when you project what will happen for the remainder of the year, we can anticipate several million more flights being cancelled. That has had a knock-on effect of reducing the available cargo capacity by at least 40%. And of course, more importantly, from an air cargo perspective and from a global economic, and particularly when it comes to addressing the pandemic challenges, it's reduced the global connectivity which air cargo utilized so greatly to support the global economy. Now, when we saw results in terms of the global economy, the countries are starting to now introduce and release their forecasted contractions for the GDP picture for this year. Most of the major economies around the world are forecasting at least a 5% contraction. France announced earlier today that they believe the GDP for 2020 will actually contract by over 11%, 11.2%. And there are severe consequences, therefore, for the economy, for production, for consumption, and for the air cargo industry, which obviously plays a vital role in that. But coming back to about today's theme, one of the biggest challenges that the industry has had to face during the last 3 months, during this time of unprecedented reduction in capacity, grounding of so many flights, is how to actually respond to the increasing demand for special cargo. When you look at pharmaceuticals alone, their demand has actually doubled just in the last 3 months. And so I'm very pleased that we have our 2 expert speakers in the area of special cargo that's going to look at all the critical aspects of how to move these items safely, how to overcome the challenges, and what we can look forward to in the coming future in terms of perhaps changes in that area. So with that, Brendan, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glyn. Thank you for that. Insightful and sets a bit of the scene for what we're going to move into next. So our first expert speaker today is Andrea Gruber. Andrea is the head of special cargo, and Andrea is going to walk us through the area of live animals, perishables, and pharmaceutical transportation. So Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Brendan. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all who joined us today. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 has caused many operational concerns impacting the 3 areas. There are a number of variables to be considered when transporting live animals. With the COVID-19 situation, some of the requirements and carriers' responsibility that are actually set in the live animals regulation were placed in jeopardy and couldn't be complied with, due to, amongst other things, to operational infrastructure and qualified staff management issues, which resulted in not being able to ensure animal safety and welfare throughout the transport. However, there are other issues of different nature that have arisen. Authorities' curfew or confinement requirements that limited the manpower available in the cargo warehouse at origin, transit, at destination to perform the appropriate handling of the shipment. Social distancing or even sickness, challenges of dedicated facilities and capabilities, as well at origin, transit, and destination, issues of priorities on emergency medical and food supplies to be shipped worldwide, and schedule issues with delayed or possibly canceled flights. It's really important to note that many countries have placed additional restrictions as to what carriers may transport. And carriers were made aware that facilities and qualified staff around the network were being impacted and not available. Thus, carriers have been temporarily assessing what can be transported in accordance with the quality and the required standards to always ensure animal welfare. However, we have seen that some carriers have restarted transporting live animals following the lifting of the lockdown measures in certain countries. But one must recognize the immediate issues of priorities on emergency medical and food supplies to be shipped worldwide today. But some restrictions of transport of live animals, such as day-old chicks, swine, or even bumblebees for pollination, which is essential for good food production, have and are still impacting the food supply. And this leads us to the second area, on the perishable aspects. The perishable figures from our Cargo IS Direct data shows really a drop of tonnage of perishable of more than 40% in March compared to the previous year due to the capacity concern. If we break it down, the tonnage of fish, fruit and vegetable and general perishable declined respectively by 30, 40 and 56%. For flowers, it declined by 18%. Floriculturists have also suffered globally from this crisis, whether in the Netherlands, where more than 400 million flowers were destroyed as demand fell, or in South America, that depends on exports and on the global airline industry. The USDA Foreign Agriculture Services reported flower sales down by 80%. Or even in Africa, Kenya, where the exports represent one of the top 3 foreign exchange earners, according to Reuters. So preserving access to food and safe food and nutrition is an essential part of the health response, but trade restrictions are breaking supply chains. Limited cargo capacity, lockdown and curfew in countries restricted the movement of workers and causing labor shortage on farms, which hindered planting, harvesting and packaging. The biggest problem lies with vegetables that are planted, harvested and shipped over a relatively short period of time. So our cargo is on the front line, not only fighting COVID-19, but ensuring that global supply chains are maintained for the most time-sensitive materials, including food and other products, purchased online in support of the quarantine and social distancing policies implemented by states. But it can only continue if we all work together with the support of governments, keeping supply lines open and trade in food flowing. However, The current operational challenges of less refrigerated, dedicated environment available are not only affecting perishables, but healthcare and life science products. An important reason for cargo's current outperformance is the ongoing demand for transporting products such as pharmaceutical, e-commerce purchased, and medical equipment. Pharmaceuticals, for example, are growing at twice the pace of last year. However, pharmaceuticals and life science products require stringent handling and transport conditions, or potentially the medicine loses its potency and may become ineffective. This really creates additional challenges within the current environment of limited air freight capacity and global connectivity, resulting from the grounding of nearly 2/3 of the passenger network. From a recent survey IATA carried out on industry expectation for handling and transporting life science and healthcare products by air, sent end of January, it shows that 47% of the 107 companies surveyed, coming from the whole supply chain, between 70 and 100% of life science healthcare products have temperature requirements. When asking in the survey if they foresee an increase of life science healthcare products with temperature requirements, 90% responded positively, whereby there were 36% that responded mentioning an increase in life science and healthcare product with no temperature. So life science healthcare sensitive products may not only require temperature control management environment, but must follow international regulatory requirements such as good distribution practices and WHO and IATA standards for temperature control sensitive products as published in the temperature control regulation. With the current situation, we all hope to see effective vaccines developed and delivered. That leads us to the next slide, please. So handling and transporting vaccines brings another dimension to the supply chain logistics. Today's air freight logistic capacity is designed to meet the existing transport of pharmaceutical and planned program of vaccination in each country. But the infrastructure and the resources will be critical as countries prepare themselves for a massive vaccination response to COVID-19, impacting all countries and territories. The upcoming challenge for the supply chain stakeholders is to plan and execute a global network delivery mechanism for the COVID-19 vaccine. With this in mind, we have to ask ourselves as an industry if the temperature control supply chain will be capable of storing, handling, and transporting such a drastic increase in quantities of vaccines. So there are a number of considerations that needs to be taken into account. First, the regulatory framework. Because of the lockdowns resulting from the COVID-19 crisis worldwide, governments authorities have enacted restrictive measures that impact trade movement. IATA is advocating with the regulators as well as with the national and international entities to reduce any negative impact. However, it's critical that countries continue to implement actions to facilitate and prioritize the movement of vital life supply chain without disrupting the supply chain. Otherwise, this will be detrimental to the public in the long run. So working effectively with health and customs authorities will therefore be essential to ensure timely regulatory approvals, increased measures, appropriate handling and customs clearance. But there will be a need to scale up sustainable cold chain infrastructure to meet the upcoming demand. More than ever, the industry needs to invest in implementing an integrated multimodal transport solution as an enhanced business model to strengthen the network and the last mile delivery. Access to and from airports and the improvement of land-based infrastructure are just initial examples. But in preparing for the future, we need to focus on consistently implementing global standards, enhance collaboration and accelerating modernized processes. Enhancing patient safety and quality of care can only be achieved by improving the usability of supply chain digitization, end-to-end visibility and transparency of existing capacity and facilities. This provides manufacturers and logistic providers the possibility to identify the level of company's competency, as well as operational and technical preparedness at airports. So this crisis must reinforce the public-private partnership. The responsibility of the COVID-19 vaccination program lies with governments, but the distribution of vaccines cannot be left entirely to the private sector. Next slide, please. So IATA was established as a standard-setting organization and as such providing the guidance, tools and standards that are compiled in the respective regulation. These standards are developed for and with the industry, and for the special cargo, we have the dedicated live animal and perishable board. Today, the existing regulations evidenced that they contain the necessary information and requirements to be followed to go through such a situation of crisis. But we have seen our industry being agile and responsive to change with the reconfiguration of passenger aircraft into cargo-only operation. But not all stakeholders today are handling or transporting special cargo. Therefore, it's really critical that they familiarize themselves with the requirements and get the appropriate training to ensure compliance, safety, and security for such commodity to be transported. In that respect, to assist the supply chain stakeholders, IATA developed tools to allow the benchmark of quality and standards of an organization. The IATA Center of Excellence for Independent Validator, CIV certification in pharma, live animals, and fresh are all based on the IATA regulations. So when transporting sensitive cargo, quality is key and cannot be jeopardized. Companies that implement quality-driven strategy programs such as CIV are well placed to understand the operational challenges, being ready to follow the standards by trained and knowledgeable staff, together with having the appropriate dedicated equipment and infrastructure. That will be an advantage in providing confidence and trust to the customer. Continuous improvement is essential, and therefore is a growing expectation to see standardization and transparency across the supply chain. This is why collaboration and alignment with industry initiatives are key elements that will transform the future. Next slide, please. To conclude my presentation, there is an increased recognition that health and sustainable developments are linked in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world. The interaction between humans, animals, and environments in emerging economies and the expanded mobility of people are all having profound social, economic, and health consequences. The transport is playing a key role in the overall well-being. As stated at the beginning of my presentation, it's essential to ensure the safe and secure transport of live animals and of legally traded wildlife, because today, illegal trade of wildlife has not only led to the dramatic decline of many species, but plays a key role in spreading zoonotic diseases. In that context, food safety reduces the problem of diseases through robust food safety policies, thereby strengthening the health security and ensuring sustainable development in a collaborative approach. So sustainable food systems are beneficial for good health. Along the same line, medicines can prevent, stop, or cure diseases. Thus, their developments are crucial. Vaccines have benefited not only humans, but also animals, and limiting the transmission of zoonotic diseases. In this connected and global environment, we are moving people, animals, plants, and product. The global approach to health includes human, animals, and the environment. This is what is meant by the concept of One Health, which is not a recent one, but is seen as a harmonized and integrated strategy of mitigating health risk in society. Many organizations have and are involved in this concept, like the FAO, the OIE, or the WHO. One Health recognizes that the health of human, animals, and ecosystems is connected and advocates coordinated, collaborative, interdisciplinary, and cross-sectoral approaches. So it is a collaborative approach which is applicable to the transport industry and is achieved through enhanced and improved collaboration and cooperation to ensure continued safe flow of products. And with that, I hope you all stay well, safe, and healthy. And thank you very much for your attention. I hand back to you, Brendan.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for that. Yeah, actually, just a quick look at the TACT operational status shows just how greatly and severely impacted operational capacity has been. I think you rightly mentioned how critical that is, especially when it comes to special cargo. So we're going to launch our first of two polls. And so please get ready to click in your answers. Basically, we're looking to find out your views on where you think over the next 3 years the special cargo business will go. So don't forget to enter there your views, and we'll give you a minute or so to select your answer. very interesting results so far. So I think we'll give you another 10 seconds or so to click your last submits. And then we will close and show you the responses that you all gave. Great, so 46% of you actually believe that it will increase between 1 and 5% year on year over the next 5 years. And actually 25% of you think more than 5% annually. This is really interesting, actually. Now that we think about it, if we think back to what Andrea mentioned about the overall industry capacity, the physical infrastructure capacity, if we're going to have that kind of growth moving forwards, then all of a sudden the quality starts to become very, very important. So thank you very much for your thoughts on that, and we'll move back to the presentation now. And over to our next presenter. So this is Dave Brennan. Dave Brennan is our Assistant Director for Cargo Safety and Standards. And Dave is going to walk us through dangerous goods, as well as touch on the cargo in the passenger cabin area as well. So Dave, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and welcome everybody to this second of our cargo webinars. Today, I'm not going to talk about the carriage of specimens of SARS, and if you go to this next slide, please, Brendan. Of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, or the movement of human remains where the cause of death was due to COVID-19. We covered those and some other topics on dangerous goods in our first webinar, and we have information on these and other specific dangerous goods issues on the IATA Cargo website at www.iata.org/cargo, and you'll see them under the heading Keeping Air Cargo Flying. Rather, today I want to focus on the broader safety objectives with the transport of dangerous goods. And if we look at the situation with the movement of dangerous goods, we now have over 50 states where the Civil Aviation Authority has issued an exemption extending the validity of existing dangerous goods training. And this recognises that there's very limited ability for companies or training providers to deliver recurrent dangerous goods training in the classroom. However, we need to remember that the provision of recurrent dangerous goods training is not just to satisfy a regulatory requirement. The purpose of recurrent training is so that the employer can be satisfied that the employee knows what they're doing, that they can do their job properly, that the employee understands the regulatory requirements around dangerous goods, and as I say, can do their job correctly. So whilst the CAA may have issued an exemption providing an extension to the validity of dangerous goods training, it doesn't mean that the employer can just ignore the requirement that the employees know and can apply the dangerous goods regulations correctly. And this is particularly important where the employees may have been stood down for a period of time or reduced hours are in place. And here the employer should consider introducing a method of verifying the employee's knowledge and the ability to do their job properly and meet the required standard. And this could be through the use of quizzes. For dangerous goods acceptance staff, it could be by doing practice acceptance checks that are then reviewed by a peer or by a supervisor. And here the focus needs to be on ensuring that the safety standards are being maintained. And the same applies to following standard operating procedures, incident reporting, and incident investigation. And as operations resume, employers should consider providing time for employees who are returning to work to have time to reacquaint themselves with the required job function, what they need to know, what they need to do. If you've got people that have been out of the workforce for a period of time, there's value in giving them that extra bit of time when they first come back to work so they're up to speed. And next slide, please, Brendan. We have the next slide. There we go. Good, thank you. We now have somewhere over 120 airlines that are operating over 1,600 aircraft. So you've got aircraft that are configured for the carriage of passengers are now being used to carry cargo and mail. And by doing this, the airlines are able to generate revenue and meet the demand for the movement of cargo. As was pointed out early in this webinar, we lost something like 40% of the cargo capacity with all the passenger aircraft being on the ground. And yet the demand for cargo is still there, in some cases higher than it's ever been. But it's critical that before airlines start these types of operation, they must perform a robust safety risk assessment to identify additional risks that may be introduced through the carriage of cargo and or mail in the passenger cabin. And then having identified the risks, what mitigations are required to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. And one of the key risks that must be addressed is to prevent dangerous goods as cargo or in mail from being loaded in the cabin. And the reason for this is that the passenger cabin has none of the protections against fire that exist in a cargo compartment. Almost all large passenger aircraft have Class C cargo compartments, and these have fire detection, fire suppression systems that are managed from the cockpit. The flight crew get a fire warning and they can activate the fire suppression from the cockpit. And the cargo compartments are also fitted with fire-resistant liners that protect the vital aircraft systems. These protections don't exist in the passenger cabin. For fire detection suppression, airlines are required to use cabin crew or other trained persons to monitor the cabin for smoke or fire, and if they detect smoke or fire, to use the fire extinguishers to deal with it. This, though, does not provide the same level of protection as the detection and suppression systems in the cargo compartments. And for this reason, our guidance document is that there must not be any dangerous goods as cargo loaded in the passenger cabin. And as mail could also contain dangerous goods, and we do allow lithium batteries containing equipment to be in mail if the post office has approval, we do not recommend that mail is loaded into the cabin unless the designated postal office can confirm that the mail bags only contain letters or other correspondence. If you've got parcels, particularly e-commerce, then there's a risk of dangerous goods, even though they're not permitted to be in mail. Next slide, please. To support the safe and efficient transport of dangerous goods by air, IATA has publications in print and in electronic formats for Windows and iOS that include the Dangerous Goods Regulations, Infectious Substances Shipping Guidelines, Lithium Battery Shipping Guidelines, and coming soon, the Compassionate Transport Manual. And this will address the movement of human remains. We've developed guidance for the industry on the carriage of cargo in the passenger cabin. And this guidance document is in its 3rd edition and can be downloaded from the IATA website from the address that I mentioned. And we also have DG Auto Check. This is a tool that automates the acceptance of dangerous goods by validating the content of the shipper's declaration against the requirements in the Dangerous Goods Regulations. And having done the document check, the checker is then presented with an image of the package showing all the required marks and labels that must be on the package based on the information in the shipper's declaration. And the person doing the acceptance check can then go out into the warehouse using a tablet that has that information on it, and they can look at the packages and validate the packages against the image. And if we look at the impact of all of this shutdown and now social distancing and concerns about potential transmission of the virus through physical means such as paper, even though that's unlikely. If we look at moving to digital solutions, then that's another way that we can keep air cargo moving, keep the dangerous goods processes working properly, but do it in a smarter and safer way. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much, and I will now hand back to Brendan.
Thank you very much, Dave. Really helpful information from you once again. Everyone, we're going to move into a Q&A session shortly. First, it's actually a poll. I want to remind everyone that they can use the questions box to send in their questions whenever they want. We've already got a number in there, but the more the merrier, and we have lots of time we can get through all of your questions. So we're now going to move into our second poll of today. And so here, we're going to launch the poll now. We want to try and find out from you how your training is adapting and what type of training delivery methods you're using or exploring now in the crisis, as well as emerging and moving forwards. So we're going to give you about 60 seconds to enter in all of your responses and see what direction you're all headed in. Very interesting responses starting to come in. We'll give you another 20 seconds or so just to get the last few responses to come in. Okay, I think we're ready to close that poll. So 46% of you are actually looking towards online or computer-based training, which obviously is a excellent content delivery, but comes with its own operational challenges and making sure that you know who it is that actually takes the course and takes the exam when required. But another 37 of the total are looking at virtual classrooms, and still many are continuing with the traditional classroom course, which is excellent, excellent insight. So thank you all for taking the time. So as I mentioned, we're now going to move into our questions and answers session with our experts. So if I can get our experts to come back, and we'll start to look at the questions that have been asked of us. So I'm going to start with the first one that came to us, and this is going to be probably first for Glyn, and then maybe Andrea would answer a little bit extra. So it's about what happens when some of these PPE flows start to lessen, and what do we see moving on these passenger flights in the future? Do we see it more as the repatriation of manufacturing sites? Do we see, as the earlier poll mentioned, an increase in some of the special cargoes? What do you see as the impact, Glyn?
Great, that's a fantastic question. And if we knew the answer to that categorically, we wouldn't be on the webinar now, we'd be somewhere else in the world enjoying probably a deserted island. I think the thing about the air cargo industry that's going to be as important now as it's ever been in its history is the ability to be agile and responsive to those ever-shifting demands. I think, as the person that asked the question quite rightly highlighted, the PPE demand will continue to evolve. Sadly, the pandemic has actually now got new epicenters. We're seeing what's happening in Latin America and Russia and some other places. There is still a high demand for PPE. So we expect the demand for PPE to continue certainly for a few more months, but in different parts of the world. We're also seeing that as countries release on some of their social lockdown restrictions, they're actually mandating that people protect themselves in public. So we can anticipate that things like hand sanitizer, which Dave can obviously address as a dangerous goods and needs to be shipped around in a controlled environment, but also personal use of PPE will continue even when perhaps medical use might reduce somewhat. Then going forward a little bit, we can anticipate that as factory production commences, that there will be a need for component restocking, as it were, so that air cargo has a role to play prior to some of the more traditional supply chains, for example, maritime, before they kick in. So I think as factory production commences, there will be a further demand for air cargo in that area as well. And this again will be global. We've seen growth of e-commerce. I mean, we talked about special cargoes, but e-commerce, when people have been sitting at home for the last 3 or 4 months, their purchasing behavior has also had to shift because stores have closed. So we can anticipate e-commerce business growing even faster than it had been before, and it was double digits before, and it's been growing, I believe, in excess of 20–25% in many areas. But then on the downside, of course, we can anticipate at some point during the course of this year, the contraction that we talked about earlier in terms of economic contraction will have an impact. Job losses will have an impact. So there will be a shift, but there's pent-up demand now. People haven't been able to replace a lot of the high-tech gadgets that they would have normally replenished. So there will be a period of flux. It might require some very agile movements of aircraft and deployment. Before we hope for 2021 of returning to, I don't want to use the word normality because there's no such thing as normal, but perhaps a period of more consistent stability.
Yeah, thank you very much. Andrea, do you want to add anything on the special commodities that we see or that you might see taking place?
Yes, thank you, Brendan. And to complement the very good answer of Glyn, we see that there is already a shift by opening some trade lanes, by having the release of the lockdown measures, really the possibility to ensure whether it's the safe transport of certain products, the animal welfare. There's been a high demand in the last 2 months to continue transporting live animals, which was really critical and very difficult for our airlines. And we see picking that up right away, because I mean it's a matter of, as I mentioned earlier, not only the aspect of the pets that need to be reunited with their owners, but conservation programs as well, and especially as well animals that are as well for food production. And so live animals definitely is picking up. We will see in the future the temperature control product, pharmaceuticals, and vaccines, because I mean the priorities on the PPE has put a lot of other products or even medicines on hold, and they are picking up as well. And food as well. One aspect is critical is not to have any food shortage. So as capacity grows, these are the area that will definitely increase.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to move over to Dave now. There's a question here around the provisions for the transporting of specimens. You mentioned briefly in your earlier in the introduction to your session about that, but maybe if you could just elaborate very briefly on what exists around the transportation of COVID-19 samples or specimens and where people can go to find additional information.
Thank you, Brendan. Well, we had some discussions very early on with the World Health Organization, and there was agreement that specimens of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, the pathogen that causes COVID-19, should be classified as UN 3373, so biological substance category B. It is in the same, in terms of its transmissibility as a specimen, similar to SARS and MERS, and all of those were classified as UN 3373. There's certainly no need to ship it as UN 2814, which is infectious substance category A. The exception would be, and we're starting to see some of it now with the pharmaceutical industry and industry in general looking to develop a vaccine, and they are moving cultures of SARS-CoV-2. So this is a very concentrated form of the pathogen. And as a culture, yes, there's agreement that that is category A because it is much more transmissible should there be a failure of the packaging, and category A 2814, and that makes it fully regulated. But simple specimens moving to confirm diagnosis or to respond to outbreaks, a category B and UN 3373 is appropriate.
Great, thanks, Dave. And we have lots of guidance material on our website on that subject specifically,
we do, yes.
On iata.org/cargo. Another question for you, Dave, here is on the passenger cabin and how the passenger cabin has similar fire suppression systems as the main deck of a freighter aircraft. So really getting into why are dangerous goods prohibited in the passenger cabin when operated specifically as a cargo-only flight. There's a second very similar question around why, for example, would accepted quantities then not be allowed, or things which would otherwise be allowed in the, if it was a passenger themselves to be carried.
Okay, in terms of the comparison between the passenger cabin and the main deck of a freighter, there are some very, very important differences. The first, as I mentioned in my presentation, the main deck of a freighter, which is a Class E cargo compartment, has the liners, which are tested. I think it's a 5-minute oil burner test. So it's a very intense flame that's put against this material, and it has to be able to withstand this flame for over 5 minutes. That does not exist in the passenger cabin. The other thing that is absent in the passenger cabin is a means to exclude smoke and fumes from the cockpit. In a freighter, the main deck, there's ways to exclude smoke from the cockpit so the crew aren't subject to smoke, that they can see properly. That too is not something that's in a passenger aircraft. The passenger cabin doesn't do that. So if there was a fire in the passenger cabin, the very strong likelihood that the smoke will get into the cockpit, and we don't want that. We want the crew to be able to see what they're doing and get the airplane on the ground as quickly as possible. In terms of dangerous goods in accepted quantity, dry ice, Section 2 lithium batteries, you could argue that all of these, certainly dry ice and Section 2 lithium batteries, passengers could have in their baggage. But if we come back to risk management, we want to reduce the risk to the lowest level possible. And for that reason, we've taken the view that it is zero dangerous goods as cargo in the cabin. And it's simply because we just don't want the airlines to be in a situation where they're going to have to deal with a fire. After all, you've now got 1, maybe 2 cabin crew observing that cabin. They're going to have to deal with it. And if you can load those sorts of cargo in the cargo compartment, that's where they belong. That's where you've got the better protections, and keep the passenger cabin for the cargo that you know does not contain any dangerous goods. And it's also cargo that's light, the PPE, masks, gloves, and things like that. It's easy to handle. It is, after all manually loaded. So we believe the passenger cabin is where you put those types of things and keep the cargo compartment for the dangerous goods.
Thank you for that, Dave. Andrea, over to you. So if you can give us some insight on how IATA plans to conduct some of the virtual or otherwise training, assessment, and validations for the CEIV certifications in the coming months and thereafter?
Thank you. That's a very good question, actually. And it's really something that is in line with what is seen today, social distancing. And when it comes to the auditing process, companies might not be very responding positively in having an outsider coming into their offices right now to come and audit. And looking at what is being carried out as well on the different auditing program, we've actually put in place a remote assessment program, mostly for companies that are without operation in the first place. That would lead to have a online virtual assessment, document-based for sure, and an online training that can already be performed. Again, I think what is really important, and we've been monitoring as well the situation of the different regulators, and we have seen that within the EU, the MHRA actually as well, when it comes to the European good distribution practices, it's quite clear that you need a clear audit process with the evidence. And but they are moving towards thinking of the possibility of remote audits, and this is what we are looking into and aligning ourselves with the thought process and the point of view of the regulators. And there are different audit processes that are moving towards that online process. I think what is really important as well to mention is the fact that on the CIV front, looking at all the assessment, the quality standards, but we can well pilot as well with another of our initiatives, like Smart Facility, that does remote validation as well when it comes to infrastructure and equipment. And I think that's really important because there is a complementary that is important, namely on the quality, the competency, the on the CIV side, looking at the training, the process and the procedures, and then as well on the infrastructure with the remote validation. So we have put in place, and we have already piloted some companies with that remote assessment, which seems to be positive, and it's for the time being an alternative to address as well one of the authorities' concern when it comes to social distancing.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to stay on because we have another question related to the potential for animal species to have been infected by COVID-19. So on to that last point, have you seen any changes, increased restrictions or regulations in the way that animals and the air cargo industry are allowed to interact at the various handling facilities?
So if I understand correctly, it's about the potential of contamination between animals and humans?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so it's a very good point, because this is something that has been explored as well, and some information is as well on our website. But the World Organization for Animal Health has actually put together a good Q&A that from the very beginning has been mentioning that there is no evidence that companion animals are playing an epidemiological role in the spread of the human infection with SARS-CoV-2. But there are some reports from infected mink farm suggest that in these environments there are some possibilities of transmission. But today we have seen that that's not really the first aspect, and there is at this point limited risk. In any case, what is really important is that for any type of such a situation is really to ensure that the proper PPE is in place, that people are following safety requirements when it comes to handling and transporting live animals, as one would do in a normal situation.
Great, thank you very much. Dave, there's actually quite a number of questions on essentially how long can a state extend the validity of recurrent dangerous goods certifications. So if you could let us know how long a state can do that.
Well, potentially a state could do it indefinitely. It is their authority, after all, to determine how to make regulations and how to apply regulations. Although I think in a practical sense, I think states are going to start looking at what alternative there could be to simply just extending. I've seen a couple of states have gone out to 6 months. I've not seen anybody go beyond 6 months. And I would think that once we sort of get into that realm, states may be saying, well, okay, what other alternative methods are there to either verify that the employee still has the correct level of understanding and application of the regulations, or that they can do some type of recurrent training. And we've already seen a couple of the states put in, a requirement for things like safety risk assessment. In other words, you have to look at your employee pool and how can you assure yourself that you're mitigating the risk that they are losing competence. Now, if people are still working, they're still doing their same job day in, day out, then you could argue that it's very unlikely that they're going to lose competence. But if you've got people that have been furloughed for a couple of months and now you want to bring them back to work and they haven't done the job for a couple of months, then I think there is a reasonable expectation that you probably should do some sort of recurrence type training before they get back to work. And I think there's also states saying, well, no, you've got to look at developing, as we saw responses in the training questions, things like Zoom, online, web-based, so alternative methods. So there's a few of that already happening, and if it were to go, I think much beyond 6 months, I think there'd probably be a broader push to look at how can we really satisfy ourselves that the employees are still competent to perform their job.
Great, thank you very much for that, Dave. Glyn, I'm going to ask you a question now on there's actually a number of them and it's been touched on by a few different people, but maybe you can give a different view on the measures that can be put in place for countries or companies which are perhaps unused to the types of goods that they're receiving today. So some of the relief goods as an example, which are maybe temperature sensitive, but certainly very time sensitive and need to be processed and expedited as quickly as possible. I wondered if maybe you could touch on that, perhaps from the overarching ICAO viewpoint, as well as some of the other measures that we put in place.
Yeah, again, that's a very good question. I mean, it's something that the industry has had to deal with quite extensively in the last 3 months. There are different customs codes and different procedures to apply for some of these clearance. Some of the situations we've been made aware of involve, unfortunately, some border blockages where people just didn't know how to classify something and it actually delayed the clearance. So I think what we would advocate here, and and I make no apologies for this, which is enhanced communication, increased digitalization, and much more collaboration here. I think it's a case of people needing to be made aware of what the regulations are up front. We have also been made aware of countries that have implemented new restrictions with regards to what can be exported. So there were some shipments where people had the approval to operate, for example, aircraft and charters, and then they found that the freight was just not released because the country had introduced a new emergency measure, which meant that things like PPE needed to get a different ministry approval prior for their release for export, because the country itself of manufacture may need to use these. So you need much more in times of crisis as well as expansion. You need much more collaboration as early as possible so people can identify what the goods are that's actually being moved, understand if there are any new regulations. We're working very closely with the WTO, the WCO, and other organizations. There's a new platform that's been released, which actually has and again, it's on IATA.org, the cargo page, where you can find new measures that have been put in place. We have a border management bulletin, which we issue, and I would urge everybody to subscribe to that. It's another free service that we provide, which is a way of communicating as emergency and in fact as new policies and procedures are implemented. And of course, coming back to the digitalization, the more the information about any shipment, about any origin, about any destination, the more you can enhance compliance, the more you can enhance efficient clearance, the greater the reliance on data. And I know we'll talk about that a lot in webinar 3, but I think this crisis has shown us, even from what we're doing now, the use of digitalization in how we communicate, how we socially integrate, how we do business how we consume things and how we live, we've become much more reliant and much more amenable to accepting what technology can provide us. And I think we need to apply those same receptors that we've been forced to employ the last 3 months into the workplace. When we actually get back into the office, we need to keep some of these practices and drive through when it comes to the improvements in the industry.
Great, thank you very much. So we actually have a lot more questions. We could probably go on for another hour or so based on the number that we have here. So as we did in webinar 1, what we will do is any question that we haven't answered, we'll get back either to the individual where there's some specific technical ones, or we'll post the whole frequently asked questions onto our website so that they'll essentially all be answered. So thank you once again to Dave, to Andrea, to Glyn for all of your insights, for the answers to the questions. And thank you again for everyone who's attending. Before we leave today, I want to provide you with some additional outreach and engagement. So Glyn mentioned webinar number 3. Many of you have probably seen that in the emails. This one, we will look at exploring the new industry blueprint. And hearing from different parties on what we think that may look like and how it's going to emerge. We'll also want to mention the cargo events. So we have our normal digital cargo conference, and you'll hear more about that in the coming days and weeks, as well as what we call our October events. And obviously, due to the uncertainty in the industry, we'll confirm these in short time. And hopefully, and very positively, we hope to see you all at the World Cargo Symposium in March 2021 in Istanbul. Now, before we close today's session, I want to play you a brief video about the air cargo industry and the vitally important work you all do. So thank you all once again, and really appreciate your time and participation today. Thank you and have a great day.